I'm gonna spend the next 30 days drawing with no experience. And I mean no experience. Like, what the The only drawing I ever did growing up was inside of middle school textbooks. My God, did I underestimate just how time-consuming and stressful this entire experience was gonna be. So why am I just now learning to draw? About a year ago, my wife got an iPad, and I thought, digital art's probably so easy, man. You just turn on the correction thing, and then I drew this. I'm a perfectionist down to my core, man. I went where every pleb goes for information. I followed along with some videos, and now I'm really confused. I realized there's all these fundamentals that I know nothing about, but I've looked it up, so now I'm stuck in this content algorithmic feedback loop. And that's when I saw this video. Meet Struthless. And he said,
draw the same thing every single day.
Oh, that's it? Just do the thing you're scared to do. Every single day. For the next 30 days, I'm gonna attempt to replicate scenes from my favorite graphic novel by drawing with this iPad inside of Procreate. At the end of the 30 days, I will recreate the first study I did to see if you can really organically learn a new skill, a whole new app, and if I can let go of this crippling, overly critical perfectionist mindset. There's nothing before day one, so therefore, the tables are clean. This is a good feeling, but also feels like any stroke you make on the page is a massive mistake. So on day one, I wasn't even confident enough to put the items in the composition correctly. I just essentially drew little doodles of objects and things I was seeing around the scene. I enjoyed drawing the bricks though. They're just rectangles, but it was cool to see how a cluster of bricks somewhat gives an illusion like the entire wall is textured. However, the face was a complete disaster. But I left the session with a sense of accomplishment. They say starting is half the battle, so we're halfway there, right? This time, with renewed confidence, I tried to draw the face again. There were multiple versions of her face online, so I decided to go with the side profile because I don't like facing my problems head on. Okay. All right, also added a bit of color, but all of my coloring and my line work was done on the same layer. So there's like these white gaps because I'm afraid of going over my pencil marks. Despite the white gaps, it was still improvement. I started to gain some confidence and I decided that today was time to try a full-scale reference. Recreating an entire scene poses so many process questions. I found myself getting lost in the weeds, texturing every single detail before all of the components were actually placed in the scene. This meant that making changes after the texture was on the objects was basically impossible. This was extremely time consuming. I know it doesn't look like I did much, but since it was my first time recreating an entire scene, I found myself paralyzed with so many questions and just afraid to make any move because every move felt like a mistake because I have no idea what I'm doing. I tapped out midway through. One positive thing about getting hung up in the weeds and over-texturing is you learn to texture. I started to notice how the textures were bundled in these groups of 2 to 4, and inside of those groups were these lines that seemed somewhat consistent of big, medium, and small. I also noticed that rougher materials like rocks had a lot more texture marks on them, and smooth materials had very few texture marks on them, faintly scattered about. Day 5. I knew if I wanted gains, I was gonna have to focus on the things that I was the weakest at. And right now, that's composition. I'm over texturing like crazy, and it's kind of ruining the overall feel of the design. So I shifted my attention to just getting all of the elements on the page. Occasionally, I was still going into autopilot, getting down in the weeds and texturing, but it was an improvement for sure. Day 6. And while we're focusing on what we're bad at, let's draw some people. Up to this point, I was drawing everything on one layer, which means any mistake meant I would have to erase everything below it. And it also meant coloring was a nightmare. But in this study, I really went for it, man. I used a whopping 20 layers. Wow! Stacking all these layers meant that I got to use a sketch. And that also meant that I got to learn what a sketch is. And my colors could stack on top of one another and be much more editable, and dang, this really helped my confidence a lot. At the end, I knew this was my greatest piece of art I had ever made, period. And I started to feel like an illustrator. Up to this point, I was pushing myself outside my comfort zone every single painting. Doing that again would be much harder this time. I started looking for any obvious improvements that I could make, and that's when I noticed I'm using a pencil to ink. What? So after digging through Blue Turtles, channel archives, I found it. I found the brush he was using, a round brush. You're all probably smacking yourselves in the face right now because in hindsight, it's not that special of a brush, but okay, it was new to me. So I started day 9, and this is where things took a turn for the worse, honestly. Going into the study, I have 3 major weaknesses that are stacking against me. Number 1, composition. Number 2, perspective. And number 3, my perfectionism. So I had this great idea. Why don't I try this large, grandiose reference? That way, if I don't overcome my 3 weaknesses, I'll be stuck in this painting forever. I started by placing some basic compositional lines. Then a rough pass of plotting out the major elements and objects and filling in around them. At this point, I started to notice a new quirk with my new brush. And when I say notice a new quirk, I mean I was losing my f***ing mind. When I zoom in, the brush size would change. So every single time I would pan around or move my camera, the stroke size would just completely change. So as I started to paint my ink layer, the line consistency was completely shot. At first, I tried to embrace this inconsistency and just say, okay, the big objects will have big lines and the small objects will have little lines. But my perfectionism alarm started going off. This isn't like the reference. So my solution? After every single pan, I was adjusting the stroke, testing it a few times, adjusting. Every single pan, every single time. This ate so much time. Up to this point, my studies were taking a few hours on average, but this one took 25 hours over 9 days. Even after it was done, I was still zooming in, not to admire it, but to overly critique all the little inconsistent lines and all of the mistakes made. I hit a breaking point. I failed my goal of recreating a scene every single day. I lost all confidence after this piece, and I legitimately thought maybe this is just too difficult of a project. Maybe I'm just not really made for drawing. Several days passed and I didn't pick up the pencil. I'm building from rock bottom in terms of confidence. So I focus on easier studies, shorter studies, studies that don't last 9 days. This helped me learn volume and inking and coloring in a much more controlled setting. And because I was focusing on these smaller studies, I felt my confidence slowly starting to grow again. And would you look at that? Since I focused on smaller studies, I was also able to figure out why the hell my lines kept changing every time I zoomed in. Once I fixed that problem, I started to feel this familiar tingle. And I'm not talking about my baby powder addiction. I'm talking about that familiar drive to do a whole reference to scale. The truth was, it had been 11 days since that last Goliath of a painting, and I knew if I waited too long, I might not try again. Study 13. The strokes finally have consistency, yay! But is it me, or are those strokes looking big? Study 14. In this study, instead of copying exactly what I see religiously, I attempted to create my own underlying structure. This helped a lot. It helped me feel more confident to just place lines where they felt good, rather than being obsessively pixel peeping every single line on the entire page, which saved me a ton of time, especially in the texturing department. Also, it took me a couple days, but I started to realize my lines are way too thick. And by the time I realized I was pretty much done with this study, but my adaptation was pretty good if I say so. I reduced the amount of texture lines, that way it still felt like there was enough space to breathe. And this whole study only took me 1.5 hours. Attaboy. So I'm halfway through and I just now figured out that there's a drawing guide. However, the first time I used it, I used this one, which did do more than no grid at all. However, wasn't the grid I needed. As I was going along, I could sense something wasn't right. Like, the grid was helping, but I knew there was probably a better grid for this. And by the time I found it, I was so far along trying to set up this new grid with what I had already drawn was making no sense at all. I was overwhelmed by the setup process, and I had so many questions like, how many of these vanishing points should I be placing? Where does the horizon line go? And the worst part is, when you're this new to something, you don't even have the right vocabulary to describe the issue you're having in order to beg Google to fix your shit. It was really difficult to see that I was actually improving some days. I was hyper fixated on my study versus the reference, rather than looking at my study versus my studies prior. Or said plainly, I was comparing myself to other people rather than comparing myself to myself. This makes it really hard to ever see your work as good enough. So back to YouTube, time to learn some new skills.
How would you say your mental focus is?
Oh, it's focused.
Day 16. So I don't think the grid was placed exactly right for this reference, but close enough for government work. The main character barely has enough room in her skull to fit a brain. But thanks to the grid, the general structure of everything was massively improved. In some areas, it felt a little stiff. And then in some areas, when I felt like I didn't know how to use the grid with a certain object, it felt like that object had no structure at all. But, you know, this was improvement, and the answers to this problem were just too far above my pay grade. Day 18. I got my perspective grid going. I got my compositional lines up. And damn, that candle looking sexy, man. But Jesus Christ, why do all my humans look like they need an exorcism? If I wanted to get a good result by study 30, I was gonna need to learn how to fix this. I spent the next 6 studies just trying to figure out what the pattern was. How was he making his faces look so consistent? Sounds like you need some methods. Tons of people have covered this topic a million times, so I'm not gonna go into too much detail. But basically, the Loomis method is a sort of framework for the skull. And then you can just place the face bits where the lines tell you to. Kind of like Mr. Potato Head. And sheesh, let me tell you what, boy. It's like the holy grail for people that are face challenged like me. Even with this method, drawing faces are still not easy, but I get a good result every 5 attempts now instead of every 500 attempts. I mean, look at this guy. He doesn't look exactly like the reference, but he looks human-ish. It's progress. So at this point, I only had 3 more studies, and this was stressing me out, man. During this study, I was all in my head. I was moving so slow, just so afraid to make any mistake at all, even during the sketch phase. It had been hours, yet I wasn't even done with the sketch. And that's when it clicked. The sketch is like a playground to develop the structure. I knew sketching was important, and I also knew structure was important, but up until this point, I didn't understand how they worked together. Now with this new information, I wanted to retry the reference I was doing yesterday. I had to have another go at it. So my second go around, I feel like I was able to obtain a lot more structure way quicker and have much more fun and just feel overall loosened up. Just don't look at her hands, man. I learned the cheat code for the face. I haven't learned a cheat code for hands. The last study. Okay, so to see how far we've really come over this whole journey, I need to recreate the first reference I did. In my first study, I didn't even place anything accurately on the page. It was really just doodles. So the pressure was kind of off. No matter what I did, it was gonna be an improvement. And in the last study, I felt like I was flying. I genuinely enjoyed myself. Crazy, right? I was a bit lost with the perspective that Blue Turtle used, but I felt confident and I was able to create my own perspective and make my own choices. I put the foreground and the background in different planes of perspective. I've never seen that online, but it just felt right. That means it could be wrong or not traditional, but I really didn't care. I was just having fun. I was finally having fun. I was finally seeing the beauty in just playing around, and the beauty in creating art and making mistakes and learning to roll with it.
$177 hours over 45 days to go from this to this.
So can you organically learn to draw by just drawing the same thing every single day? Yeah, I think you can. I still have a lot I can improve on, and I don't know if I really only drew one thing every single day, but I think the sentiment of that advice is constrain yourself. So for me, that meant constraining myself to copying one artist that I really love. And for you, that might mean drawing some trash can bird every single day. Now, I've drawn all sorts of things since, and I've noticed that learning to draw gave me improved memory, it improved my handwriting, it improved my ability to plan and organize my thoughts, additionally my motivation to follow through on those thoughts. I also acquired 3 new instances of spinal pain, tendinitis, and I transformed my Apple Pencil into a cracked Apple Pencil. So what about learning within an app? Let's say all you care about is learning to draw and gaining the benefits I talked about, and you don't have digital art tools readily available today. Don't start here. You might run into a lot of red herring issues like waiting to start learning until gear arrives and losing all motivation, not knowing what brush to use. Plastic to glass surface contact feels completely different than drawing on paper. Learning to navigate through the menus to find hidden settings causing days and days of frustration, and is possibly the reason why I'm a proud owner of 2 Apple Pencils. Not to mention learning certain digitally relevant terminology that is frankly intimidating as hell if you've never used it before. Whereas pencil and paper is just, you know, but once you get past the software growing pains, there's a ton of features that make drawing much less punishing. And personally, when I feel less punished for the thing that I'm trying to learn, I'm much more likely to continue trying to learn it. But let's say you have experienced 3D modeling or using Photoshop or some other software. The growing pains of learning a new software compared to your first software it's not even close. It's much easier to learn another software once you have one under your belt. So if you're someone like that, maybe it is easier for you to learn inside of a digital setting. I don't know. I used to think I'm not an illustrator, and now I realize we're all illustrators. It's just a matter of how much you embrace that part of yourself that makes you, you. I'm kind of capable. Thanks for watching.